in recording in progress, that's what it's called, to this installment of this year's fundraising appeal. Don't worry, you're not going to get the hard sell, but what we've done this year for our fundraising appeal is to showcase the scholarship and teaching at Leo Baeck College. And that means we're holding a series of lectures and discussions on what we hope will be interesting ideas that are advanced at Leo Baeck College. For those of you who don't really know too much about what Leo Baeck College is, first of all, it's not the Leo Baeck Institute, which is something a little bit separate that looks at the history of German Jewry. But Leo Baeck College, which has been established in the early 1950s, is the UK's rabbinic training institute for progressive rabbis. That's Reform, Liberal, sometimes Masorti, and others. We also have a wider public education program with our Lehrhaus, which you can find on our website. There might be things there that you might be interested in. But really what we're doing at its heart is training rabbis to look at the Jewish future, to be adaptable, to be resilient, to be the sort of rabbis that are needed to lead progressive Jewish communities now. So that also means that the faculty needs to include people who are up to date with what is going on at the Jewish world, who are connected to the main trends in what is going on. And one of those people is me. As senior lecturer in the college, I teach a course called Understanding Jewish Communities. I teach another course called Talking About Israel, which is about how Jews talk about Israel and about how the conflict between Jews on Israel impacts on diaspora Jewish communities. And but I also have I also work outside of Leo Baeck College too. I write. I'm a sociologist, and I commentate on Jewish affairs. And it's in that capacity that I want to introduce my co-speaker this evening, who is Dr. Ben Gidley of Birkbeck College, where I used to teach, and which I'm still a fellow of the Birkbeck Institute for the Study of Antisemitism. Ben, would you like to briefly introduce yourself?
Hi, yep, it's great to be here. I'm Ben Gidley. I'm a reader in psychosocial studies and sociology at Birkbeck, and also an associate of Birkbeck Institute for the Study of Antisemitism. And I've been on and off collaborating with Keith for some years, and I'm very grateful for this invitation.
Thanks. Yes, as Ben said, we both worked together at Goldsmiths College on a project that became our book together. It came out in 2010, which I think Ben has a slide on. So I won't plug it now. It's also a little bit old now. But what both Ben and I are interested in, amongst other things, it isn't so much what's going on in Israel, but in how the politics of Israel and Palestine impact on diaspora Jewish communities, in particular the UK, and in how that relates to anti-Semitism. And given what's been happening since October the 7th last year, although of course with continuities before that, we've been doing a lot of thinking and commentating and struggling to understand our present moment. So what we're going to do this evening is a kind of, I suppose we're checking in on where we're both up to in understanding what's going on. And not so much on what is happening within Israel itself, but how it impacts over here. I will be focusing a little bit more than Ben on what's going on inside the British Jewish community. Ben will have a slightly a broader focus than that, but we will probably overlap to some extent, although hopefully in interesting ways. So what we're going to do is we're both going to speak for about 15 minutes each. Then we're going to do some kind of dialogue between us. And then hopefully around 8 o'clock, we will open things up for questions. We would prefer you to use the chat box for questions, which you can put in at any time. If I miss anything, please feel free to repost the question. I'd also direct your attention to the chat box because there is a link there to the fundraising appeal. And if you like what you see here, it would be really great if you could help support the college and support more conversations like this one. Okay, so I'm going to go first, and I'm going to share my screen in the way that is, and probably get it wrong, in the way that is fairly normal. Zoom, can you all see that? Is that all okay?
Yeah.
All good. Okay. So we called this the war over here and the war over there and the war over here, to emphasize that there is an intimate connection between the two. To emphasize that this is not what's happened since October the 7th, isn't something that happened in one small corner of the world. It is something that impacted not just within the diaspora Jewish populations, but in whole swathes of opinion across the world, to such a point where I think it's an open question, and one we will discuss this evening. What is the join between over there and over here? So the first thing I want to mention here, although it's not going to be a main focus of what I'm talking about here, is just to note that organizations that monitor anti-Semitism, both in the UK and many other countries, have shown considerable spikes in anti-Semitic incidents after and in the months following October the 7th. I'm sure that's something that's not much surprise. And although some people do quibble with some elements of what this, in this example, is the Community Security Trust in the UK, what they count as an anti-Semitic instance, it's pretty difficult to deny the general trend line, which is this big spike and a continuing spike that has continued more or less ever since. Now, but this talk isn't just about anti-Semitism. And in any case, it's hard these days to distinguish anti-Semitism from other aspects of this wider Israel-Palestine conflict, and indeed from other political issues as well. It's not something we can just sort of leave on one side and say that it's a kind of, as probably in many ways that I grew up with, that it was one bit about being Jewish, but it's one thing that you could sort of say it was an issue with certain boundaries around it. What I want to argue is that in many ways, if you look at how the conflict plays out in the UK, you see, as I say, this blurring of the lines between over here and over there. And you can see on the streets of Britain, you can see that there are very big demonstrations on behalf of the Palestinians, but also visuals and demonstrations of mostly of a smaller size in favor of Israel, or in favor of the hostages, or various other activities that could be broadly understood as pro-Israel. But it's worth mentioning that one of the differences between over here and over there, which is that however one views the war in Gaza, it's hard to deny that it's an asymmetric conflict, in the sense that certainly at the moment, Israel has vastly more military power to control the situation, or to attempt to control the situation as it wishes. Israel is an advanced industrialized power, economically fairly wealthy, with an experienced and highly advanced military. Gaza, well, and Hamas, it's a little different. But that asymmetry becomes more complicated when you think about the war over here, in the sense that there isn't necessarily a level playing field, that both pro-Israel and pro-Palestinian sides are of equal power. It's a lot more complicated than that. But certainly it's true that to be a pro-Palestinian activist in the UK is to face less obstacles than a pro-Palestinian activist, not just in Gaza, but also in the West Bank, in the Palestinian Authority territories. So the idea of an asymmetric conflict here becomes a lot more complicated and a lot more difficult to understand, but it also bleeds into each other, in the sense that pro-Palestinian activists over here sometimes identify with the sense of not just treating Palestinians in Gaza as oppressed people, but that oppression is also carried out outside of Israel as well. And they do point to some reasonable points, in the sense that in certain contexts within the UK and elsewhere, to be a pro-Palestinian activist can be quite difficult and can be subject to certain kinds of legal restrictions and so on. But on the other hand, to be a pro-Palestinian activist in London is certainly not the same as being a pro-Palestinian activist in Gaza. Another side of this is that Jews and Muslims over here are treated almost as proxies sometimes for Israelis and Palestinians over there. Now, that's very visible in the case of Jews, in the sense that Jews are often treated as if they were Israelis or as proxies for Israelis. What is sometimes less visible is that does happen with Muslims. And interestingly enough, not just Palestinian Muslims, and of course, not all Palestinians are Muslim in any way. And that's one of the differences in many ways, in the sense that Jews and Israelis probably share more ethnically than Palestinians and, say, Pakistani Muslims over here. In fact, a lot of Muslim involvement in pro-Palestinian activism is led by Muslims who are not actually Palestinians, because the strength and the size of the Palestinian diaspora, it varies across countries. So this idea of Jews and Muslims and Palestinians and Israelis as being all meshed, sort of all enmeshed together, is, I think, quite strong. The idea that we can keep these clear boundaries between these categories, while it may or may not be preferable, is often not how things actually play out. There's another possible asymmetry over here as well in the UK, in that Jewish-Israeli diversity is much more visible than Palestinian or indeed Muslim diversity. So it's as I wrote in my 2019 book, Strange Hate, it's very, very easy to find Jews who will agree with you, regardless of what one's position is. So these are just three images I took at random. On the left, you find an image of a Hanukkah gathering by Na'amod, which is a leftist, non-Zionist or anti-Zionist group of mostly young Jewish activists. In the middle, there's the National Solidarity March Against Anti-Semitism, which was organized, I believe, by the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism, which is a particular faction within the British Jewish community, although one would say a much more sizable faction than the Na'amod faction. And there on the right, you have the good old Neturei Karta, who are often at the front of pro-Palestinian demonstrations, an anti-Zionist Haredi sect. And these three images don't constitute the entirety of diversity within Jewish and Israeli opinion. There's, as I say, whatever kind of opinion you have on Israel-Palestine, you will be able to find a Jew who agrees. If you're looking for Palestinians to agree with you, they usually exist, but it can sometimes be more difficult to find them. There is a kind of, almost in a lot of pro-Palestinian activism, there is often a deliberate attempt to de-emphasize differences, not just between Palestinians, but also between other people within demonstrations, in a way that it's become much more difficult for Jews to do in their own pro-Israel demonstrations. Which leads to a question, which is, what do protesters actually believe? And this, I think, is one of the central dynamics of what we're seeing at the moment. On the right is a tweet from last November by Yi Barlow, who is a British online activist against anti-Semitism, who said, "The people who marched in London yesterday aren't mere bystanders, they are worse. They are perpetrators. Every one of them is a Holocaust denier. Every one of them is a person thirsty for Jewish blood," and so on. Now, empirically, that is not an easy statement to research, let alone justify. My own view is that these demonstrations contain considerable factions and considerable differences between them, which are often occluded for different reasons by both their supporters and their detractors. So their detractors, like Eve Barlow, it suits them to homogenize these demonstrators, but the demonstrators themselves, to want to seem a stronger bloc, will often de-emphasize those differences as well. So those differences could include, you might have factions within demonstrations that from Hizb ut-Tahrir and other Islamist groups. You might have them from secular left groups, from secular Jewish left groups, from Haredi anti-Zionist groups, and also, it should be said, a lot of people who are there because they cannot stand seeing the suffering in Gaza. But really, it's very hard to tell what the sort of balance of opinion in these marches are, because it suits a lot of people's interest to not look at it too closely for different reasons. And the same is true to some extent within certain kinds of pro-Israel activism as well. So last week, there was, after the Phoenix Cinema was vandalized for showing an Israeli film, there was a solidarity vigil organized at very short notice by some people within the Jewish community. And there was a small Palestinian counter demonstration. I kind of forget who was the counter demonstration, who was the main demonstration, but it doesn't really matter. The pro-Palestinian side were a lot smaller there. They were kept apart by police. Now, in that demonstration, there was a faction from the non-Jewish far right, some of whom were being very aggressive towards some pro-Palestinian activists, using racist language and so on. Now, a lot of that was shared online and seen as proof of the irredeemable racism of the entire march. So that's very much what happens with detractors to the pro-Palestinian marches as well. The one chooses what one wants to choose as the defining characteristics of these march, when usually what's going on is a much greater heterogeneity than is sometimes represented. Now, when you look at all demonstrations, vigils, online trolling, all this ferment of discourse, it's interesting to look at trends within more general opinion polling. And one of the interesting things, and this is from a report by the Institute for Jewish Policy Research, where I also work, but it's not from a survey that JPR conducted themselves. It's quoting a YouGov tracker poll. And it shows that immediately after October the 7th, there was a big spike in sympathy with Israel, which subsequently settled down a little bit. But it suggests that pro-Israel, confirmed decisive pro-Israel opinion and confirmed decisive pro-Palestinian opinion is probably at fairly similar rates most of the time, except in particular moments. But there are an awful lot of people who don't really know or who sympathize with both sides. So looking at these sorts of polls, if you try and correlate them with, say, records of anti-Semitic incidents, they often don't really conform at all. And if you look at them compared to the tenor or the tone of demonstrations and online conflict and so on, they often don't track at all. So one of the questions this raises is how far the visibility of this conflict actually resonates beyond Jews, Palestinians, Muslims, and other people who are concerned principally on the left, or how far is this a minority kind of pursuit? It's not entirely clear. Another thing I wanted to point out, and I want to finish soon, I apologize for running over, is that it's often not mentioned that one of the things that has followed the October the 7th attacks is this Jewish organizational response, When Jews, certainly in Britain and in many other countries, feel that there is a crisis, they want to organize their way through that crisis. This is a report that came out about a month ago by the Jewish Leadership Council called Forge the Future, which is this hugely ambitious strategy for the UK Jewish community post the 7th of October. The details of it are not important here. What's important is that it is seen almost automatically by Jews that when something bad happens, there has to be an organizational response. And we've seen also in the Jewish community a fair amount of new projects or projects that were going to launch but got relaunched. And it's not clear how long all of them are going to survive. I don't know how many of you here have heard of the Z3 project, Global Jewry, or Writing on the Wall. All of them were launched with a fairly big splash in the last few months, and they're all global projects interconnected with Israel, designed to respond to what is going on at the moment. And their impact at the moment is very unclear and probably will remain unclear. We should also mention that an organizational Jewish response is also very significant within Jewish pro-Palestinian circles. It's not entirely clear how far the ranks of the sort of people who would go to join the Jewish Bloc for Palestine, how far that represents a wider increase in Jewish pro-Palestinian sentiment, Jewish anti-Zionist sentiment. I think it would be surprising if there wasn't some growth, particularly with young people, but it's still not clear how far a possible increase in that opinion more generally correlates with the increase in the size of Jewish blocs of various kinds on demonstrations in London and elsewhere. What is certainly true is that whether you're on the left or the right, or where you stand on this conflict, if you're a Jew, the organizational imperative remains very strong. I want to raise one final thing, which is about liberal Zionism, which is the more centrist, center-left kind of Zionist opinion that is not in sympathy with Netanyahu, that believes in a two-state solution, and that some of whom were out demonstrating against Netanyahu around this time last year. Liberal Zionism of that kind, which I think forms the center of gravity in a lot of Jewish communities, including in the UK, has had quite a difficult time. On the one hand, being horrified by October the 7th, on the other hand, in quite a difficult position, given that this war is led by Benjamin Netanyahu. And as the war has gone on, you started to see the emergence of greater discontent, particularly in the last few weeks regarding Rafah, about whether Israel should go into Rafah or should not go into Rafah. But it's a these sorts of groups speak in a very, very careful way, because they want to be able to have traction within Israel, with whom they're deeply connected, within the Jewish community in Britain. But it's a very, very delicate area. So organizations like the New Israel Fund, or the Our Jewish Values Statement, which was set up by progressive rabbis, particularly Josh Levy and Charlie Baginski, they almost speak in a sort of code. And I'm not suggesting that because of any kind of intent to deceive, but in the fact that they of wanting to support Israel and using a phrase like "Together for Israel Now," without being completely sucked into a process they can't control. And that requires a very, very complicated sort of discourse that is ever changing and is very, very difficult to pull off. And when we're talking about now, this is my final slide, don't worry, Ben. I just wanted to point out that the most consensual position in the Jewish community, the one that has the broadest investment across the board, has been free the hostages, as one would expect. And there have been various vigils for the hostages, demonstrations too, that have been organized over the last few months, by Jewish representative organizations such as the Board of Deputies, the Jewish Leadership Council, and so on. And these are still continuing. But in the last few weeks, it's becoming clear that within Israel itself, free the hostages is becoming increasingly associated with not just anti-Netanyahu opinion, but also increasingly pro-ceasefire opinion. The situation in Israel is very, very febrile here. And so this is an interesting moment about how diaspora Jewish opinion that has wanted to be consensual and pro-Israel may be put in a fairly difficult position at some point. In fact, I think it already is. And this is another way in which the difference between over here and over there is sometimes hidden, sometimes open, and sometimes it's very, very difficult to disentangle. And this is the situation we are in now. And yes, I want to hand over to Ben Gidley.
Thank you very much, Keith. I'm just going to open my slides. I've only got, I think, 2 images that that were also in your presentation. Second. Okay. So, yeah, I guess the things I'm going to talk about resonate with what Keith has said. Some of the things I'll say very much echo what Keith said, and some of the things will take us in different directions. I guess I want to try and say something about the echoes of October the 7th and its aftermath. It's in the UK Jewish community, which would kind of echo a lot of what Keith said, but then also on the British left, on the UK Labour Party, and on the UK right. And I'll maybe try and very tentatively sort of conclude with some thoughts on the reconfiguration of the mainstream community. I should also say, just before I start, that I'm going to draw in what I say with kind of work that I've done over the years has generally been very much collaborative, including, as Keith mentioned, over a decade ago, we worked together on this book, Turbulent Times, about the British Jewish community today. More recently, I've been working with David Feldman and Brenda McGeever at Birkbeck on thinking about antisemitism, and more recently still with Daniel Mang and Daniel Randall thinking about the left's response to Palestine solidarity. So I'm going to go through each of these in turn, and I guess I'm going to start exactly with where Keith finished, thinking about the mainstream Jewish community, and Keith's point that liberal Zionism is the kind of secret center of the Jewish community. And I think all of the data that we have from JPR, these are some slightly outdated tables from 2010, 2015, but the more recent research by JPR pretty much confirms the same thing, with one slight difference that I'll mention it a bit later on. That basically confirms that liberal Zionism is very much the hegemonic position within the British Jewish community, even if it's not necessarily articulated in that way. So very, very high levels of identification with Israel, very high levels of personal connection to Israel, fairly high levels of identification with Zionism, consistently in this 70% sort of plus territory for most of the 2010s. But at the same time, strong support for a two-state solution, strong support for peace negotiations, giving up territory in exchange for guarantees of peace. And I guess October the 7th has been a crisis for the Jewish community for all of the reasons that Keith has spoken about, but it's been a crisis in particular for liberal Zionism, because many of those positions, which is widely supported in the British Jewish community, have become untenable in the context of the way in which Netanyahu and his government have prosecuted the war, with the possibility of a two-state solution, of negotiations, of trading land for peace kind of becoming ever more distant. This kind of broad picture, I think, is affected by three major kind of sociological dynamics, which we can see playing out within the British Jewish community. They've been playing out in some ways in other diaspora communities, but they have particular texture in the UK where these three kind of dimensions and dynamics are particularly prominent. So the three of them, which I'm going to talk about for about a minute each, are insecuritization, Israelification, and the new anti-Semitism. So insecuritization, I'm picking up here on something that Keith and I spoke about in our book. We spoke then about what we called a strategy of insecurity, which was pursued by the Jewish communal leadership from the 1990s to the 1990s onwards. And I think our argument was really that if you look at the way that Jewish communal leaders today talk about the insecurity of the community under attack in many ways, contrasts really sharply to the way it was spoken about just half a century earlier in the mid-20th century, the period of Mosley, the period of Hitler, where the communal leadership very much underplayed threats to Jews at home and abroad. They underplayed the threat of Nazism. They didn't want the community to talk about it. They didn't want the community to come out publicly on the streets against Oswald Mosley. Instead, they emphasized the secure belonging, secure citizenship of Jews within Britain. Paradoxically, this was a time when Jews very much were a kind of outsider minority, the biggest kind of ethnic and religious minority in Britain in the pre-Windrush period, and were far from secure, in contrast to today, when Jews are much more kind of woven into the fabric of British kind of cultural life. In the book, we talk about what Keith named a kind of reflexive turn in the 1990s, the question of Jewish survival. Will we have Jewish grandchildren, to quote Rabbi Sachs? And then after the Second Intifada of the current century, increasingly a focus on Israel and anti-Semitism as these two kind of linked existential threats: the existential threat to Israel, the existential threat to diaspora Jews posed by anti-Semitism, particularly anti-Semitism associated with the left and Islamism. And this change we link to a kind of broader historical shift to what Ulrich Beck, sociologist, called a kind of risk society, where groups compete not for goods as they did in the kind of social democratic era, but for bads, to have their problems addressed and listened to by the state. And this was also a shift from a kind of normative British monoculture to a acceptance of diversity across society, where Jews kind of belatedly tried to find a place at the multicultural table by asserting some of the kind of specific issues that the community faced. What I think we didn't really kind of emphasize in the book, we spoke about a strategy of security, very much a top-down discourse emanating from the leadership to kind of maintain its legitimacy at a time of increasing integration. And what I don't think we really kind of paid enough attention to is that this was accompanied by, at a very grassroots level, a real shift in the kind of emotional register of the community in the face of both very real rising anti-Semitism, real kind of physical threats to the community, and a kind of discursive, or particularly in the Jewish media, sort of emphasis on those threats. So a kind of deep-seated sense of insecurity. This deep-seated sense of insecurity was kind of really triggered, of course, by the attack by Hamas and its allies on Israeli civilians, including family members of British Jews, on October the 7th. And so I think we're living in the kind of most intense moment of that dynamic of insecuritization, which has unfolded in the last few decades in the British Jewish community. And this has been accompanied by what we could call a kind of Israelification of the community. I think Toby Green calls this Israelization. I think Israelification is kind of sounds better. Kind of, we can see this linguistically in the way that kind of modern Hebrew has kind of replaced Ashkenazi pronunciation and of Yiddish, the attenuation of kind of Yiddish culture. We can see it in a culinary sense, the disappearance of or the kind of decline of Ashkenazi food replaced by Sephardic food. As on the screen, you might be able to see an article from the brilliant food magazine Vitals called "The Rise of Middle East Medilevantia." People have called it the kind of Ottolenghification of the British Jewish palate. But there's been, along with kind of easy access to Israel, family ties to Israel, Ben Judah talks about EasyJet Zionism, there's been an increased sense of proximity for British Jews to Israel, and this has really shifted the dynamic within the community and intensified why October 7th played a kind of key role. That's exactly the same slide again, isn't it? And then thirdly, the third dynamic, which is linked to this, is what we can think of as a kind of in the face of what's been called a new anti-Semitism in the current century, a kind of new anti-Semitism, which is an anti-Semitism not so much based in anti-racism as based in the sense that Jews have been excluded from the anti-racist movement, the sense in which racism against Jews, or anti-Semitism, often not even understood as racism against Jews, is kind of not taken seriously by other minorities, by the state. And we've seen this kind of anti-Semitism increasingly prepared to sort of express itself publicly in a way that would have been pretty much unthinkable for most of the 20th century. That kind of idea that Jews don't count is very much grounded in the sort of absolute inhospitability of the mainstream British left to most mainstream Jews, something which kind of reached its height in the 2015 to 2020 last leadership of the Labour Party. And so I just want to say something about the kind of dynamics on the British left that echo, or that kind of that complementing those dynamics within the Jewish community have created a sort of huge parting of the ways between the left and the Jewish community. And those four dynamics, go through them one by one. I guess anti-Zionism as the cultural code of the left. This cultural code is a term taken from the historian Shulamit Volkov. It's the idea that anti-Zionism is the kind of litmus test, the shibboleth of belonging and identity for people who are part of the kind of left-wing community. That's kind of unifies and binds quite disparate political traditions, people that believe in all sorts of different versions of leftism. There's at least as many versions of leftism as there are versions of Jewishness. They bound together by this kind of common code of anti-Zionism. And I think linked to this, we can see secondly a kind of fetishization of Israel-Palestine, that over there that Keith was talking about kind of becoming central to left-wing politics over here. This diagram on the screen may not be, it's probably very busy and crowded. This is some analysis I did for the All-Party Parliamentary Group Against Anti-Semitism in the wake of the 2014 war. 2014 was a year of global conflicts, South Sudan, Nigeria, Afghanistan, and it's also the previous rounds of Russian invasion of Ukraine. And you can see that across the media, there was a massive disproportionate attention given to Israel-Palestine compared to these other conflicts, and a massive under-attention paid to conflicts within Nigeria. But this disproportion grows the further you go to the left, looking at the media. And so The Guardian, for example, paid considerably more attention to Israel-Palestine. This is the number of articles in the year 2014. So basically, The Guardian had, an article every single day about Israel-Palestine compared to 79 about Ukraine. And then if you look at the kind of far left, Socialist Worker or Morning Star, an even bigger disproportion. So I think this kind of illustrates the way in which Israel-Palestine has become absolutely central to the imagination of the left. I think this centrality is perhaps linked in ways that the left doesn't like to acknowledge to histories of Christianity and the kind of idea that the Holy Land is kind of geographical center of the world, I think the left kind of remains within that kind of Christian galaxy. The third dynamic, which links to this, is what we can call a kind of Manichaean, a binary black and white version of anti-imperialism, or what on the left some people call campism, the idea the world is divided into the camp of the good and the camp of the bad, and everybody's that's against, you know, America and Israel are ultimately the good guys, even if they might be a little bit authoritarian. And so we can see that in the kind of celebration of certain forms of right-wing Islamist politics, Hezbollah, Hamas, for example, within the Palestine solidarity movement, are very much a kind of binary worldview. So binary worldview in which Israel and Palestine are at the center and represent the kind of struggle between imperialism and the subjects of imperialism, and kind of the good and the bad. And then finally, a kind of truncated anti-racism, probably really best illustrated by Diane Abbott's kind of now kind of infamous comments about the difference between anti-Semitism, or the racism suffered by Roma, in comparison to what she called kind of real racism. So a kind of an anti-racist, an anti-racism that's linked to this binary Manichaean vision of goodies and baddies, where Jews are kind of associated with whiteness, with the baddies and the powerful. And so in this context, the kind of alienation of the Jewish community from the left, which was kind of growing in the late 20th century, despite the kind of liberal pro-peace two-state kind of politics that are actually dominant within the Jewish community, has deepened. These dynamics, both of these dynamics, have played out within the Labour Party, and it's kind of ironic that as the Labour Party is kind of surging towards electoral success, the one kind of electoral thorn in its side is that its base, its kind of electoral base in the metropolitan part, kind of multicultural, young, educated metropolitan parts of Britain, are kind of fully subscribed to this kind of anti-Zionism as the cultural code, and turning against the Labour Party, kind of condemning it for its kind of tepid stance towards what's going on in Gaza. Whereas the leadership has kind of is a good demonstration of the success of the Jewish communal strategy of insecurity, that the leadership of the Labour Party, like the leadership of kind of most mainstream parties in Britain and in many other countries, has kind of also adopted a kind of anti-Semitism as its own cultural code, as a sort of to distance itself from the radical left, to show that they're good allies of the Jewish community. And so the idea of a kind of zero tolerance for anti-Semitism within the Labour Party, which Keir Starmer has articulated, kind of shows the success of the Jewish community's ability to kind of market its insecurity to the British state and to kind of British mainstream political parties. But it's also created a huge conflict within the Labour Party as probably the next party of government. Finally, the right, this echoes what Keith was saying about Finchley, whereas one part of the right that hates Jews more than they hate anybody else has kind of tried to ingratiate itself with the Palestine solidarity movement, with probably limited success in 3 dimensions, but quite a lot of success online, where far-right messages are quite widely amplified within the Palestine solidarity movement. But on the other hand, a kind of a growing part of the right, which hates Muslims and migrants more than it hates Jews, has used the cause of Israel as a kind of and a kind of skin-deep allyship towards Jews, as a way of kind of fighting many of its cultural wars against the left, against Muslims, against migrants. This is kind of embodied, I think, by Tommy Robinson. Tommy Robinson, as you know, was kept away from campaign against anti-Semitism, organised march in London a few months ago, but we have seen plenty of other instances of far-right figures being welcomed, and so a kind of significant part of the Jewish community has kind of embraced this. Oh, what's happened? My last slide. I guess, is to think about what do we do with with what's going on, that, as Keith said, and I think this is one of the images that we've shared, there's a kind of growing number of Jews taking a stand against Israel's policy as Jews beyond the kind of long-standing kind of core group of Jewish anti-Zionists. A much larger number of kind of Jewish communal members have been mobilized in Palestine solidarity. Even before the war, JPR noted that 79% of British Jews disapprove of Netanyahu, and I think that kind of figure has grown. And they noted that Zionist identity has dropped from, I think, 72% to 62% before the war began. It'll be interesting to see what happens the next time that kind of JPR kind of takes the temperature, whether those numbers continue to trend. More recently, the Union of Jewish Students, whose survey reached Jewish students who are connected to JSOCs, and so the kind of communal mainstream Jews, found quite large numbers who didn't identify with Israel, 29%, 16% feel negatively towards it. Quite large numbers kind of don't identify as Zionists. And so the question of whether a Jewish community kind of that is centered around an attachment to its kind of a dominant mood of insecurity that feels kind of under attack, that's kind of continually reliving the 7th of October as the kind of emblem of its insecurity, will have space or not have space as liberal Zionism kind of crumbles for those parts of the Jewish community who are more critical of the state of Israel. So I think that's the last thing I want to say. I guess the other, similarly, the question of whether the community will continue to sort of respond to the claims of allyship from the Islamophobic right, or whether it will draw clear lines as it did against Tommy Robinson, is another kind of crucial question. Whether there can be a renewal of a kind of more anti-racist form of anti-Semitism and a kind of some kind of dialogue between Muslim communities who, as Keith said, are also feeling under attack in Britain, or whether that kind of parting of the ways will continue. And finally, whether that kind of Israelification of the community might paradoxically open up the possibility for kind of more what Michael Rothbard calls kind of multi-directional thinking, with a sense of the kind of cultural kinship between British Muslim communities who are increasingly identifying with the Middle East rather than South Asia, as two kind of Middle Eastern Mediterranean communities within Britain might be ultimately some kind of grounds for a different settlement between minorities in the UK. So I'll stop sharing. And,
thank you, Ben. Before we open up to questions, if you want to put questions in the box, now's the time to do so. Get thinking. I just wanted to raise a couple of other things that we've talked about privately, but neither of us put in our talks today. One of them is what I would call complicity discourse, which is, well, I'll tell my favorite anecdote. My favorite anecdote is last November, a woman employed by the States of Guernsey, which is the government of Guernsey, in marketing the island to French tourists, resigned because the president of the States of Guernsey had raised I think they put an Israeli flag up outside the island's parliament, and the president had issued some statement of saying we're sorry for Israel or whatever it was. And this woman who worked for the tourist board said Guernsey is complicit in the genocide of the Palestinians, which kind of overestimates the power of the states of Guernsey quite considerably. But we've seen this discourse only grow since October the 7th, and the Eurovision was another front in that, when Ollie Alexander, the UK entrance sort of expressed a certain amount of bewilderment that he was being told that if he went to the Eurovision Song Contest, if he didn't boycott it, he would be complicit in genocide. So that's kind of, it's almost like a second order of boycotting, that you're not just boycotting Israel, you're boycotting anything associated with it. My worry about that complicity discourse, aside from the fact of not being particularly good from a sociological perspective, is that it enmeshes, actually it enmeshes many Jews who are not supporters of the state of Israel. And I wonder how much this is a rhetorical move that doesn't have a great deal of substance to it, or whether this will create an impossible situation with Jews, where the only way that one can assert one's goodness is by publicly, very, very publicly, issuing a series of press releases distancing oneself from the state of Israel. I don't know how serious this is, how far it will melt away, how far it's paper thin. You're very plugged into those sorts of far left circles. What's your take on it?
Yeah, I think that's that culture of the discourse of complicity and of silence, the condemnation of anything that's taken as being silent is, I mean, in universities, it's a really powerful discourse, and I think that it's a particularly kind of I think it comes from that anti-Zionism as a cultural code. It comes from the kind of moralization of politics of in the age of kind of when we pursue bads rather than goods. It comes from kind of social media attention economy, and this kind of idea that we need to always perform ourselves as good people rather than, you know, that we kind of constantly have to stage manage ourselves as good people. But I think it falls particularly heavily on Jews in spaces such as academia or the arts, where they're particularly called upon to sort of demonstrate that they're not silent, that they're not complicit, and that and because many Jews feel complicated and nuanced and torn and so on, in an age when nuance is frowned upon in kind of in response to what's going on in Israel Palestine, it can be really uncomfortable. I think that's one of the kind of key issues that's going on. I think it's only going to get worse.
Oh, that's cheerful. That was going to be the next thing I wanted to talk about, which is I'm wondering where this is going, and to some extent that's going to be determined by the Israeli government and the Israeli military and what they do in the next few weeks and months. But it's not exclusively there, and as someone who is certainly not supportive of Israel's actions at this precise moment, in the previous few months, it's a bit more complicated. I do wonder if we will ever be forgiven for this, even those of us who were not supportive of this. And in that respect, the important question to me about genocide is less whether what Israel is doing meets the definition of genocide, so much as what the impact of using that term will be on Jews in the diaspora, but also Israelis as well. It's quite difficult to see a path through this that doesn't end up ensnaring, not, as I say, not just Jews who feel themselves supportive of Israel, but also Jews who are ambivalent, and also Jews who at the moment at least are opposing Israel's actions.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think there is a dimension in which the response of communal leadership, which has to make a call as to how much it's going to speak in defense of Israel versus in defense of British Jews, um, has some kind of, the kind of communal leadership has some kind of role in that sort of in mirroring that sort of discourse of complicity, which and blame, which comes from the left. I think there's a kind of, because the Jewish communal leadership constantly has to navigate the extent to which it's going to exceed the kind of narrow remit of commenting on things to do with British Jews versus commenting about Israel. It kind of opens up that space for kind of for the complicity discourse to sort of leverage, I think. And I think that's partly to do with maybe the thing that we underemphasized in our book when we kind of posited a sort of top-down strategy of insecurity, that there's also a kind of upward pressure from within a deeply insecure community, kind of calling upon the leadership to kind of to also stand in defense of Israel, that then marginalizes other parts of the community.
I mean, that it's often the tale of diversity in the British Jewish community is told as left versus the rest, but actually one of the less remarked on stories in the last about 10 years has been pressure against organizations like the board or the UJIA or the Jewish Leadership Council from the right. So there's this new organization that was set up a year or two ago called the National Jewish Assembly, which is a kind of alternative representative organization from the right. There's also the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism, which is viewed, I mean, it's barely a secret that most mainstream Jewish organizations are deeply suspicious of them and often find it very, very difficult to cooperate with them. But that only sort of exacerbates the dilemma of maintaining a center around which the Jewish community can revolve. And that's before you even think about the Haredim, which is growing at a rate of about 5% a year, and have a completely different way of representing their concerns to the world, and have a very different way of relating to Israel. So I wonder if in the next, whether that sense of a mainstream will be able to hold at all.
I think this relates to, I think what Valerie has put in the chat about the emergence, not of an anti-Zionist identity, but of a kind of diasporous Jewish identity, which doesn't place Israel at the center of their world view. I think this is, I think this is a kind of a real thing, and it has a generational dynamic. I think that kind of surprisingly large number of kind of UJS connected Jewish students who are kind of indifferent to Israel, maybe speaks about kind of one version of that, or the kind of development of more explicitly kind of diasporist sort of identities, exploration of different kinds of Jewish histories, is part of the picture. I think there's a kind of definitely doesn't any come close to sort of challenging the mainstream normative sort of the statistical kind of dominance of a kind of strong identification with Israel within the community, but it's definitely a growing kind of increasingly significant minority. And I suppose the extent to which that can be kind of accommodated within the community and community structures is a kind of key question.
So also to respond to Valerie's question, there's a kind of paradox about diaspora Zionism. I mean, certainly the early generations of Zionists would find the idea nonsensical, those sorts of Zionisms that were based on the negation of diaspora, which still exist but don't have the same kind of power that they're used to. But the paradox is that Zionism has been very successful in providing confidence to diaspora Jewish communities so that they don't leave for Israel. And that is something that is very, very difficult to capture and to explain to non-Jews, is how one might the idea that there is a state of Israel makes it easier to be a British Jew, and that sort of it cuts across diasporist and Zionist narratives really in quite interesting ways. The other thing is, in the 1990s, and it feels a long time ago now, there was a period within Israel and in diaspora Jewish communities that people like Yossi Beilin were talking about, and even within the Jewish agency, there were people talking about we need to evolve a relationship toward a partnership. And I think for some of the people involved, it was very sincere, that it was putting diaspora and Israel on the same interdependent relationship. I think that sort of discourse has been rowed back on, particularly since within the Israeli national institutions, you have a more right-wing Zionism that is not particularly interested in that kind of partnership. But it does show that the sort of the stark diasporas versus Zionist identity is in practice often much more complicated than that. There's another thing as well, which is simply that it's pretty difficult as a Jew to completely ignore Israel and to be I don't know how you can be a complete diasporist, in part because there are lots of Israelis in the diaspora, and some of them Zionists, some of them seeking to get away from it. Thank you, Connie. And I don't see how you can ignore half the world's population and create something that is entirely diasporist. It doesn't really seem to make much sense to me. Valerie said Zionism was given diaspora Jews to not have to make killer. Is that what you meant, Keith? I.e., that a strong Israel over there means one can feel safe, okay, over here. Yes, I think that's a kind of narrative that is quite strong in the Jewish community that I think survey research tends to back up. I don't think it applies to absolutely everybody. I think that there's a discourse also of being able to leave that is one of the ways in which Jews express fear and insecurity, whether or not they leave. In fact, I think if Corbyn had got in, there was a lot of this discourse, oh, I'll leave. I think that if Corbyn had got in, I think there would have been an uptick in immigration to Israel, but I don't think it would be anything like the sort of immigration you saw in the former Soviet Union or places like Venezuela, for example. Just before I turn to Ben, does anybody have any other questions or comments? Feel free to put them in. Ben.
Yeah, I would agree with that. The kind of survey data has showed a kind of persistently high number of Jews who are kind of in a state of British Jews who are in a state of having their bags packed and ready, but consistently kind of low immigration numbers. And even in France, which is kind of very much one of the epicenters of violent anti-Semitism and kind of insecurity, much higher kind of rates of aliyah, but also large numbers of people who kind of return or have a kind of circular migration, kind of seasonal sort of Zionism, and I think, you know, fairly high numbers of kind of immigration to places other than Israel as well. So that kind of having your bags packed as an option in order to kind of maintain a sort of to articulate insecurity while maintaining a kind of secure position, I think is a key. Yeah, is real.
I also want to mention something else about those figures from UJS. One of the great changes that happened in the British Jewish community over the last 20, 30 years has been the rise of Jewish schools. And I wonder how the impact of the normalization of Jewish schooling has impacted on Israel attachment, and particularly impacted on Zionist youth movements through which Israel attachment has often been expressed and through which many young generations of young Jews have been socialized. It is quite striking that a lot of that percentage, not so much of those who are anti-Israel, so much as those who aren't really invested, don't really care that much, a lot of those will have been to a Jewish school. So there is a sense of one of another discourse that we've seen a lot recently is also particularly with regard to the Jewish bloc and young people's organizations like Natamod is we have failed in our Jewish education with young people very sort of quite histrionically. But a huge amount of resources have been put into Jewish education and Israel education. And I think that leads to sort of questions about how much this is people voting for their feet saying, I don't want to be part of this sort of discourse of complicity and silence. I want nothing to do with it. So for that, we'll need future research. Ellen says, how much of UK discourse has been influenced by America, e.g. university processing campus, critical race theory, where Jews are positives as white oppressors? Ben, you're in the epicenter of this. Your office is around the corner from SOAS. There are encampments and stuff. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I can hear the SOAS encampment out of my office window most days. Yeah, I think there's been a massive degree of US influence on almost all of the dynamics that I spoke about on the left, but also on the right and within Jewish communities. I think the kind of the age of EasyJet Zionism is also an age of kind of internet, global Jewish media where British Jews consume American and Israeli media, British leftists consume American and, global leftist media and so on. So we're all kind of extremely globally networked, definitely within what I call the truncated anti-racism that's become dominant on the left, has a connection to, I would say, the sort of global export of American models of racism. America's history of race and racism is very specific, relates to history to do with transatlantic slavery and kind of the political disenfranchisement of Black people while a kind of official ideology says that everyone is created equal. And so kind of race and Blackness, the relationship between Blackness and whiteness has a particular kind of texture in the US, which is very different from other parts of the world. But that US model has become really hegemonic within both academia and popular anti-racism as a way of understanding racism. And as you say, Jews are often posited as white oppressors within that kind of binary framework and kind of truncated anti-racism. At the same time, I would say that the right, when I spoke about the right's courting of the Jewish community and its own culture wars against the left and Muslims and migrants, has kind of the American, culture wars, which aren't really relevant to our everyday lives here, have been really absorbed in the UK and that kind of and played out on our streets. And so what we saw in Finchley last week was partly a playing out of a kind of something that was launched in the US and sort of been globalized through global networks. And I'd say that the kind of panic about critical race theory is one part of that. There's nobody, very few British academics actually identified as in terms of critical race theory until it became a kind of scare word for the right. So kind of Americanization of both sides of the discourse.
So Frank Miller mentioned something about the rapid growth of the Muslim community and its religious anti-Semitism. I suppose it is true that in opinion polls you've shown consistently, I mean, it's a complex story, high levels of anti-Semitism within Muslim communities. Whether one could call that religious anti-Semitism is a much more complicated issue. Particular, I think that ethnicity and race bleed into each other in the way that Muslims in Britain certainly relate to Jews, how they relate to Israel and stuff like that. I think religious anti-Semitism isn't quite the right word there. Ben, I'm not sure what you think.
Yeah, it's a really fraught question. I've been doing some research for the past couple of years as part of a transnational research project on Jewish-Muslim encounters. We've got, I think, one of my French colleagues, Hande, is in the virtual audience here. We've got a team in France and a team in Germany. And it's definitely the case that in all three countries, you can see in when people are asked about their attitudes to Jews, a somewhat higher percentage, like 20-30% compared to like 8-15% in the general population, will say, yes, I have kind of hostile views towards Jews, or yes, I agree with that anti-Semitic statement. And so there's definitely an issue about kind of acceptance of quite a lot of anti-Semitic myths percolating within parts of Muslim populations. However, I think a lot of that relates to how people are trained to answer surveys and not sound like the bad guy when you answer a survey. So it's kind of to do with a whole number of other dynamics. And if you look at kind of everyday life in areas where Jews and Muslims live together, if you look at kind of interfaith activism, if you look at commercial relations in, say, the food trade or garment trade, you can see lots of examples of kind of positive day-to-day relationships, trusting, warm relationships, even when there's kind of negative stereotypes circulating, both, I'd say, Islamophobia within the Jewish community and anti-Semitism within Muslim communities.
But if those sorts of relationships persisted, I mean, that's one of the questions here, that there's often a sense that inter-religious, interfaith, inter-ethnic relations are often much worse when people make statements than in terms of pragmatic everyday interaction. But there are also instances where things break.
Absolutely, yeah.
And are we in that situation?
Yeah, definitely. This is a moment, of breaking. That a lot of interfaith group initiatives have kind of come under pressure, although new interfaith initiatives have also emerged. So yeah, there's places where we did field work where we saw kind of like lots of examples of kind of positive interactions that were then, after October and November in particular, the sites of some kind of quite heightened confrontation. So yeah, it's definitely a kind of breaking time. If you look at the CST data on perpetrators of incidents, you can see that every year when there isn't a spike in violence in Israel-Palestine, kind of far-right motivation is the kind of big constant sort of dominant tone of kind of anti-Semitic incidents. And then in these spike years, that flips, and kind of Islamism and anti-Zionism become kind of more prominent. That comes and goes. It gets triggered with what's going on in Israel-Palestine. Obviously, a more long-term, intense situation in Israel-Palestine is going to push that to its limits.
So I think that we should probably end on asking you, and I'll weigh in on this is a very difficult, bleak time, there's no question about it. Where are the sources of hope? I'm going to give a shameless plug for one source of hope, which is Leo Beck College. We are a great academic community, scholarly community, who train great rabbis and do great community outreach work. If you've enjoyed this session, there is a link in the chat, and I think Rivka will post another one there. No gift is too small. Well, I mean, probably there is a gift that's too small, but we won't say no even to that. So that's one thing. In terms of hope, I'll start, and then Ben can think about it. For me, there is probably hope in the sense that another discourse that's floated around is that we cannot go on like this. And when people start saying, and enough people say, we can't go on like this, that can be a moment where things can change. And if you want to, in Israel itself, there's been a huge upswing in civil society activism intended to push back against the possibility of total war or genocide or whatever. Groups like Standing Together, for example, that have been sending out patrols to guard aid being sent to Gaza. It concentrates the mind, a situation like this. Whether enough people in the British Jewish community are saying we can't go on this. Thanks, Ross. Ross is in Nottingham, and there is a Standing Together branch, Friends of, in Nottingham, and there's one in London as well. It's a great organisation. Whether in the British Jewish community, we are aware of that question, things can't go on like this, is to me a more open question. But there are always possibilities when things become impossible. Ben, provide us with some hope.
I don't have many resources for hope, but I think I agree that Standing Together is perhaps one of them. I think that for every moment of every experience of kind of anti-Semitism, every experience of kind of hostility, that also those moments also do generate kind of the desire for solidarity, the desire for dialogue, and we've seen the emergence of interfaith initiatives that kind of, while some interfaith initiatives have collapsed in the autumn, others have kind of re-emerged or been initiated. We've seen people drawn towards groups like Standing Together that represent a kind of different kind of discourse against the sort of dehumanization. I would say that the kind of a space like this, provided by Leobeck College and other kind of parts of the community where there is a sort of possibility of dialogue that resists that kind of mutual dehumanization of people over here in the echoes of what's going on over there, kind of mean that there is always a space for recognition and just human connection remaining open, and we need to really just nurture those spaces with all of our energy.
Absolutely. So before I forbid people from leaving the call just yet until I've given another plug, which is for next week's talk with on Rabbi Scholar Activist, a Perplexed Guide. That's with Rabbi Dr. Deborah Kahn-Harris, who is my wife and the principal of Leobeck College, with Professor Johanna Stiebert of Leeds University and Rabbi Robin Ashworth-Steen, who is a Rabbi Magister who is teaching at the college now. All three of them are interested in what it is to work for social justice in the world and how to do it through a rabbinic theological lens. And it's another of the ways in which Leobeck College is out in the world and trying to think through these issues about how we make a contribution to making the world a better place. There's also a huge amount of suspense there, in the sense that Deborah has lost her voice quite seriously. And it's going to be exciting to see whether her voice returns by next Thursday. And if anybody wants to start a sweepstake, proceeds going to the college as to whether Deborah's voice comes back, please just contact me. And finally, there's a comment from Anne Andrich who said the Israeli and Palestinian bereaved parents in the Families Forum who say if we don't talk, it won't stop. And so we are talking, and hopefully it will stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Take care. Thanks, Ben.
Thank you, Ben and Keith, very much indeed. Thank you.
Anything to say or debrief, or should we just leave with everyone else?
Yeah, I think we're done. I should end the meeting.
Thanks very much, Ben. A pleasure as always.
Good night, everyone.
Cheers. Thank you very much.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Sophie.
Cheers.
Thanks. Bye-bye.